Bless the Lord, O my soul, bless.
Whenever we address a prophetic post-biblical revelation, we're always mindful of the church's position on it, because the majority of post-biblical revelations are not of God. And even though the minority are, they're of great importance and they require utmost attention. Take, for example, what you mentioned, the Divine Mercy devotion, promulgated by the servant of God and blessed then now Saint Faustina Kowalska, who initially encountered opposition. Right? She was born in 1905, died at the age of our Lord 33 in 1938. And before her writings attained the status of magisterial approval, bearing the church's nihil obstat imprimatur, and her name being raised to the altar as a saint in her feast day, being part of the church's martyrology, and her devotion becoming a universal feast in the Catholic Church on the first Sunday after Easter, her writings went through a series of tests that are parallel to the tests encountered by the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta. To overview these tests, we must first bear in mind that these events leading up to the church's approval, both of Faustina's writings and Luisa's writings, several of which enjoy church approval, we must bear in mind that the church sometimes reverses its position, and for reasons that it articulates. Let's first look at Faustina and then Luisa. From 1942 to 1959, Sister Faustina's writings and devotion to the Divine Mercy were published in many languages and spread internationally. And something similarly occurred in the writings of the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta. They were first published in 1915 until 1938, the year in which the Vatican sequestered them, much like they sequestered the writings of Faustina for further review. Luisa's writings were published in 1915 by St. Hannibal and in many languages and spread internationally. Now, the writings of Faustina constitute the prophetic revelations from Jesus on the Divine Mercy, contained in what is known today as the Diary of Saint Maria Faustina Kowalska, Diary, Divine Mercy in My Soul. On the other hand, the servant of God Luisa's writings constitute the prophetic revelations from Jesus on the divine will, contained in 36 volumes entitled The Book of Heaven, and in 2 works entitled The Hours of the Passion and the Virgin Mary in the Kingdom of the Divine Will. And it's noteworthy that these works today, that is, the Hours of the Passion and the Virgin Mary, compare the imprimatur nihil obstat, as does the writing of Faustina, Divine Mercy in My Soul. Now, I mentioned that Faustina's writings began in 42 and spread to 1959 till they were put on the index of prohibited books. Luisa's writings spread from 1915 till 1938 till they were sequestered by the Vatican, okay, and put on the index of prohibited books as well. 3 of her works, none of her volumes, but I'll explain that in a moment, why the Vatican eventually reversed its decision, as in the case of Faustina and Luisa. Let's go now to 1938. The Holy Office, back then known as the Holy Office, now it's the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, issued a decree that suppressed 3 of Luisa's works on the divine will and placed them on the index of prohibited books. The same thing they did with Faustina's work in 1958. Luisa 1938, Faustina 1958. The Holy Office issued a decree that suppressed St. Faustina's writings on the Divine Mercy and placed them on the index of prohibited books along with those 3 works of Luisa. In 1959, a year later, the Holy Office, as now the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, issues a notification that suppresses the spreading of the devotion to the Divine Mercy as presented in St. Faustina's writings. So Faustina's writings are placed on the index of prohibited books in 58, And then a notification is just issued by the same office, stopping the spreading of the devotion to the Divine Mercy. Let's go to Luisa. 1938. 3 of her works, none of her volumes, are placed on the index of prohibited books alongside of those of, well, they will be eventually beside those of Faustina. And many years later, a moratorium would be put on spreading conferences and devotion by Archbishop Carmelo Casati in the 90s. And the reasons I will explain in a moment that are justifiable. Okay. Now we get to the reasons. First, the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta. The reasons of the 1938 decree that merited the suppression of these 3 books were a false and dangerous mysticism and exaggerated and erroneous presentations in a language and terminology superabounding with inexactitudes and extravagances. This is an expression from the Holy Office, 1938. Other concerns were the excessive exaltations of and concentration on Luisa. Parallelly, the reasons in the decree and notification in 1959 against Faustina's writings, and that merited the suppression of her devotion to divine mercy, were based on theological difficulties such as the claim that Jesus had promised complete remission of sin for certain devotional acts without specifying whether the forgiveness would be obtained directly or through the reception of the sacraments, and what may have been thought to be an excessive concentration on Faustina herself. See the parallels? Too much attention on Luisa, too much attention on Faustina found in these writings. In Faustina, not enough emphasis on the sacramental reception for an indulgence. On Faustina, false, exaggerated mysticism, erroneous presentations, and extravagances and inexactitudes in terminology. Now we get to 1965. An informative process of St. Faustina's writings and life is opened by none other than Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, the year in which I was born, 1965. He would eventually become coronated Pope John Paul II, in my opinion, the greatest of all pontiffs, and second to Ratzinger in terms of theological prowess, but the greatest of all pontiffs. And he encouraged by Cardinal Ottaviani, who was at the time the prefect of the Holy Office, Cardinal Karol Wojtyła reviews these writings in 1965. So this is 6 years after they were put out, her devotion was oppressed, 7 years after her writings were placed on the index. The prefect for the doctrine of faith, Cardinal Ottaviani, asks Karol Wojtyła to review Faustina's writings, and he does so. In 1967, 2 years later, the informative process closes and Cardinal Karol Wojtyła sends acts to Rome in 1968. And the process of beatification of Saint Sworth Faustina, Sister Faustina, begins. So really, thanks be to God for Karol Wojtyła's review. Had he not done this, I believe perhaps to this day her writings would not be acknowledged and her Divine Mercy Feast Day would not be accessible, which is sad. But nonetheless, God provided. Right? Now, at around the same time, on the flip side, we look to the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta. After consulting the appropriate Vatican curial offices to determine whether there are any objectives to Luisa's cause of beatification, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints grants permission in the 1990s to Archbishop Carmelo Casati to begin a diocesan investigation into the person and writings of Luisa. So Luisa's writings were placed on the index 20 years before Faustina's and were rehabilitated 20 years after Faustina's. Okay? Then we come to 1978. The Sacred Congregation reverses its decision on the decree and notification banning the Divine Mercy devotion found in Sister Faustina's writings and officially approves for public devotion the Divine Mercy writings and image. Parallelly, in 1994, the Sacred Congregation for the Causes of Saints declares, on the part of the Holy See, the non obstare, nothing obstructing, the opening of the cause of beatification for the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta. So, yeah, so there are parallels. And then we see in 1978, Cardinal Sepper and Archbishop Jerome Hammer of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith explain the reason for the reversal of its 1959 judgment against divine mercy, against its image, against its devotion in the writings. And this is what Cardinal Sepper and Archbishop Jerome Hammer of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith state. They made this statement in 1978. The question has arisen from different regions, especially from Poland and from those in authority, whether the prohibitions contained in the notification of the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, published in the Acta Apostolic Sedis, regarding devotion to divine mercy in the form proposed by Sister Faustina Kowalska, are considered still in force. Having examined many original documents unknown in 1959, there is the key. There were documents missing that offered clarification on the sacraments which were required for the indulgences. So part of Faustina's writings were published in 1950, when did it start? In 1942 till 1959. And during this period of about 15 years, 42 to 59, many of her excerpts were published, but not the whole diary. And parts that were essential to understanding the proper reception of the devotion to the divine mercy were missing in these published materials. So in 1978, Cardinal Sepper, along with Archbishop Hammer, state that the notification was reversed because, having examined many original documents unknown in 1959 and considering the circumstances that have profoundly changed, and having taken into account the opinion of many Polish ordinaries, meaning bishops, the Sacred Congregation declares that the prohibitions contained in the cited notification against the divine mercy devotion are no longer binding. Moreover, the previous concerns of an excessive concentration of Sister Faustina in the divine mercy writings are supplanted by virtue of a more thorough examination of the text, in which such exaltations are counterbalanced with admonitions and affirmations of her wretchedness and ineptitude without God's grace. So basically, the Holy Office did not review carefully enough what materials it had to dispel the excessive concentration on Faustina, and it was incapable of thoroughly examining her devotion and the indulgences attached to the divine mercy because many of the writings were not available. Now let's go to the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta's parallel story. Remember, 1978 was the year in which Faustina's writings were rehabilitated. In 1994, this was the case with the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta, about 16 years later. The Sacred Congregation for the Causes of Saints declared, in quotes, on the part of the Holy See, the non obstare, meaning nothing obstructing, for the opening of the cause of the beatification of the servant of God, Luisa Piccarreta. The previously held false and dangerous mysticism, exaggerated and erroneous presentations in a language and terminology superabounding with inexactitudes and extravagances contained in 3 works were due to editorial changes. That the suppression of the 3 works was not on account of Luisa's writings, but that of the editor. And this is further evident in the official seals of the Nihil Obstat and Imprimatur conferred on the first 19 volumes that Luisa wrote. And also the concerns over apparent exaltations, excessive concentration on Luisa were counterbalanced also, as in the case with Faustina, with admonitions and affirmations on her frailty, wretchedness, and inability to do any good without the assistance of divine grace. Then in 2005, Luisa's cause of beatification concluded its diocesan iter, and shortly thereafter there began the preparation for the critical edition of her 36 volumes. And then we come to another stage. Even though the Church has now officially given its seals of approval to several of Luisa's works and Faustina's works, and even though Luisa's cause and Faustina's cause are open for beatification, despite all this, several religious, including priests, lay Catholics, publicly oppose the divine mercy and publicly oppose Luisa. They still resist the Church. And this is the reason why, even though the divine mercy devotion has been incorporated into the Church's martyrology and been declared a universal feast, there are many Catholics that reject it because they're not obedient to the Church's magisterium. These are the people who do not answer to anyone but themselves. And these people, Jesus reveals to Luisa, are the type of people that will continually fall in and out of God's grace because they do not allow themselves to be guided by the beacon of light, which is the voice of God through the Church. Okay? So there are many parallels, and the similar parallels also happen in the writings of two individuals like Blessed Antonio Rosmini and the recently departed Greek prophet Vasula Riden, whose writings have multiple imprimaturs, nihil obstats, and so forth. So yeah, this is the journey of the prophet today. They go through a martyrdom, and only after their death are their names and causes and devotions rehabilitated. Very seldom during their lifetime. We see this also in the case of Joan of Arc, right? The Church burned her to the stake. And the Church that put her to death declared her a saint, but never declared her a martyr. Isn't that interesting? Why? Well, who martyred her?